welcome back to the grand finale of sentences, the complex sentence. Yes, it is challenging, it is complex, but I know that you can do it. What made the simple sentence and the compound sentence similar is that they dealt with only independent clauses. We did not introduce anything but an independent clause into our simple sentence and our compound sentence. However, our complex sentence is complex because we're going to take the basis of our simple sentence and we're going to add a dependent clause. So we're going to have one independent clause and one dependent clause. The combination of these clauses is what makes a complex sentence. The only way you can get a complex sentence is to combine at least one independent clause and one dependent clause. Let's review the difference. An independent clause has 4 elements. The 4th element is going to be different than the 4th element of a dependent clause. The 4 elements of an independent clause, hopefully you've memorized this by now and all of this is just instant recall, is going to be our subject, verb, object for academic writing, and a complete thought. Those are our 4 elements for our independent clause. Our dependent clause has the same first 3 elements, a subject, verb, and an object if it's academic writing. However, remember that the 4th element is different. The 4th element is it poses an unanswered question. So it is going to be an incomplete thought. We want an incomplete thought. I know it's challenging to go completely the opposite direction. However, remember I said that when you pose an unanswered question that later in the sentence or somewhere in any order within that sentence, you must answer the question. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to do it in the complex sentence. We want a dependent clause and an independent clause. Where it gets a little complicated is that they can be in any order. You can have a dependent clause first and then an independent clause, or an independent clause and then a dependent clause. So I'll go over both of those with you. First, make sure that you can remember your 4 elements before we start to put these 2 together. Because we just finished with simple sentences and compound sentences, you should be good with your independent clauses, right? So remember, no unanswered question in the independent clause part. I like to abbreviate the independent clause with a capital I and a capital C, independent clause. My dependent clauses, I like to abbreviate with a capital D and C, dependent clause. That way I can write them out and try to remember the elements without forgetting anything. Your independent clause has no question, and remember you don't want anything before your subject, right? That is our independent clause. When we're forming our complex sentence, you want to make sure that with your independent clause you're not adding anything before the subject, because you don't want to accidentally convert your independent clause to a dependent clause or to anything else. So our independent clause, you should be good with those. So you want an independent clause and a dependent clause. How you can come up with your dependent clause, this is what works for me, is I simply write an independent clause, right? A subject, verb, object, complete thought. But then I take a subordinating conjunction and I add it to I make it the first word of that group of words. So if I were to say, we'll take an example I just used, I love the 4th of July. If I take my subject, verb, and object from I love the 4th of July, I can add any of the question words. It's one word. Remember our subordinating conjunctions. Remember that handout. There's at least 50 that's on the handout, and there's probably hundreds of subordinating conjunctions altogether. Any one word that could pose a question is a subordinating conjunction. If you take I love 4th of July and add any any of the subordinating conjunctions, add one before your subject, you've now downgraded your independent clause to a dependent clause because you've introduced the unanswered question. Going back to our hierarchy, remember that we have sentences. With our sentences, we have our complex sentence is the highest of the hierarchy that we are going to cover in this course. Your complex sentence, right below that in the hierarchy, is your compound sentence. It is harder, it has more elements, therefore it is higher in the hierarchy than your simple sentence. Our ultimate goal is to form at least one of those three sentences. Below that, you have your independent clause. Your independent clause, because it's independent, it can stand on its own. All it's missing is end punctuation, and it will be bumped up and upgraded to a simple sentence. Below our independent clause, we have the dependent clause in our hierarchy. The dependent clause cannot stand on its own. It must attach to the rung right above it, which is the independent clause. If you want a very simple way of coming up with a dependent clause is write an independent clause and put a subordinate conjunction before your subject. I love the 4th of July. I can say because, right? A subordinate conjunction, it's one word, because I love the 4th of July. I have a proper dependent clause. If I just said, I love the 4th of July and put a period at the end, it doesn't make any sense because the reader will want to know why. If you say because, you need to give a reason, right? Unless you're a mom and you say because I said so. Now in the 21st century, I'm not sure if that still holds up. But the word because, you can use the word when, right? You can use the word after. You can use any question word and it will instantly downgrade your independent clause to a dependent clause. It can no longer stand on its own. Because I love the 4th of July, that is a dependent clause. However, I love the 4th of July is an independent clause. It's a complete thought. It stands on its own. Because I love the 4th of July, if it's in this vacuum, if there's no other context around it, if I didn't answer the question somewhere else, if it's all by itself, it cannot stand alone. It cannot stand alone. It is a dependent clause. If you don't take an independent clause and just add the subordinating conjunction before it, it's very simple to construct. You simply need a subordinating conjunction, a subject, and a verb. It's great if you add an object. However, an object is often not required, even in academics with a dependent clause, because your independent clause that the dependent clause joins to will have an object. So somewhere in your sentence, you have an object that both of the clauses are going to be talking about. However, in your dependent clause, it might be helpful, it might provide more information and give more specifics if you have an object. But do know that an object is not required, no matter what writing you're doing it for, if you have in your dependent clause. Again, because your object will be in your independent clause. I encourage my students to add the object because it's great practice. Again, it does give you, if you add the object, it gives you an independent clause, and it's always great practice to continue to write independent clauses. So a subordinating conjunction is going to be the first space, right? I like to abbreviate this by a capital S, lowercase ub, and then a capital C, subordinating conjunction. So I would write, if I'm writing out my formula, I would write SUB, capital C, so subordinating conjunction plus a subject plus a verb. And then it's up to you whether you want to add an object. I like to add an object, so I put a plus O, plus the object, and that is going to give you equals your dependent clause. Those four is your dependent clause. Remember, your independent clause is the exact same minus the subordinating conjunction. Subject, verb, object, complete thought. Your dependent clause question word, subordinating conjunction, subject, verb, object, which gives you an incomplete thought. There's two ways to think of this. You can either think of an independent clause and a dependent clause having the exact same four elements in the same order, being a subject, verb, object, but change the last element to be, for an independent clause, no unanswered questions, so a complete thought, and the dependent clause being the opposite fourth element of having an unanswered question. Or you could think of it as an independent clause being a subject, verb, object, and a complete thought, and a dependent clause being in this order, a subordinating conjunction, subject, verb, and, if you would like, an object, right? So the subordinating conjunction is the unanswered question. When you're writing out your formula, it will go in this order. Remember that your subordinating conjunction is one word, and it's the first word in a group of words. If it's not the first word, it doesn't make it a dependent clause. It is the definition of a dependent clause is that a subordinating conjunction is the first word, followed by a subject and a verb. Okay? Let's do a quick practice. As I mentioned, we can do either the dependent clause first, properly join it to an independent clause, add the end punctuation. Or we can do an independent clause, properly join to a dependent clause, and add our end punctuation. There is only one difference. Whether you choose to put the dependent clause first or the independent clause first, the only thing that changes is whether or not you use a comma in between them. This is one of those things where if you do the comma wrong, the entire sentence will either be right or it will be wrong. So if you do the comma wrong, the entire sentence is wrong. If you do the comma right, your entire sentence, if everything else is correct, is right. And of course, we are students, we want everything to be right, everything to be perfect. Here's the rule. If the dependent clause is first, you separate the dependent clause and the independent clause with a comma. So the formula would look like dependent clause, so capital D, capital C, dependent clause, comma, independent clause, IC, period. DC, comma, IC, period. So you're posing an unanswered question, you're putting a comma, and then in your independent clause, you're answering the question. When you combine the two, when you have a complex sentence, there's always going to be an unanswered question. So somewhere in your independent clause, you need to be answering that question. Unlike a compound sentence where you could talk about two totally different things, you could talk about your day at school and you could talk about the party you went to on Friday night. Two totally different things, you can still join them together in a compound sentence. However, there is only one purpose of a complex sentence, and that's to pose a question and then to answer that question. That is the only reason why complex sentences exist. It's to allow us, primarily those of us that are not asking questions of our readers. We're not just asking them, do you need this product? Do you want this service? We're giving statements. But it allows us to get a little crafty and to still pose questions and then answer the questions without directly asking a question. So if you use the dependent clause first, it's a dependent clause, comma, independent clause, and punctuation. Pose a question, comma, answer the question, period. If you do it the other way around and you do an independent clause and then a dependent clause, here's your formula. Independent clause, dependent clause, period. There is no comma, there is no punctuation in between. IC, DC, period. IC, DC, period. It's common to want, like instinctually, we want to put a comma in there, but that is not the way it works. A comma only follows if a dependent clause is first. If I say, because I like the 4th of July, that is a dependent clause. So I have my dependent clause, I add a comma. Because I love the 4th of July, I always take the day off. That's my independent clause, I put a period. So I'm saying, because I like it, and the reader's wondering why, like, what is the consequence? What's the reason? Tell me more about because you love it. Like, what are you attempting to, what is the full story? So I'm saying that because I love the 4th of July, I always take the day off. So if someone were to ask me, why do you take the day off? It's because I love the 4th of July. I love it so much that even if it wasn't a federal holiday, I'm going to take the day off. I could do it the other way around, and I could answer the question first and then show what the question was. I can say, I always take the 4th of July off, or I always take the day off because I love the 4th of July. So no matter what order you do it in, you can pose the question and then answer the question. You can answer the question and then pose the question, right? So it's almost as if you do the independent clause first, it's almost as if someone asked you the question and now you're just answering it. But you still have that question element in there. As a review, a complex sentence has one independent clause and one dependent clause. The independent clause has 4 elements: a subject, verb, object, and a complete thought. The dependent clause has 4 elements: a subject, verb, object, and an incomplete thought. The object for the dependent clause is optional, even in academic writing. You can join them together by having either a dependent clause and a comma, your independent clause and a period, or you can have an independent clause, a dependent clause, and a period. Remember that this is a sentence, so you must have your end punctuation. Remember that you only add a comma, and it should be the only comma in your sentence, unless you're doing a list, if the dependent clause is first. If the independent clause is first and you're answering your question before you're asking your question, you do not put a comma. That is everything you need to know. Please refresh yourself on the list of the subordinating conjunctions. Remember that what makes a dependent clause a dependent clause is that you've posed an unanswered question. It relies on the independent clause to then answer the question. In our hierarchy, we have a complex sentence, a compound sentence, a simple sentence, an independent clause, a dependent clause, and then everything else that isn't even high enough to constitute a clause. That is a complete review of our sentences. It is now time for a quiz. It's time to look at any handouts and to do the worksheet. Please spend as much time as is required. I know you're busy. Spend as much time as you can practicing complex sentences. You also want to go back and to re-practice simple sentences and compound sentences, because you don't want to get mentally stuck in the very last thing that we learned and then have every single sentence you write from here until eternity be a complex sentence. The goal is to add a variety, a mixture of simple, compound, complex in a variety of different orders and lengths of sentences. We don't want every sentence to be the same length. We want to vary them. Simple sentences are going to be shorter. It's one independent clause. That's it. Compound sentences are going to be longer, probably the longest, because it's 2 independent clauses. Complex sentences might be a little shorter because dependent clauses and then independent clauses combine. Oftentimes the dependent clauses have less words in them, but it's still a more sophisticated technique. All 3 of these combined will give you writing that is, if done correctly, is flawless and gorgeous in every sense. practice, practice, practice. In this course, we're not going to get into combining them into actual writing. That's going to be saved for a writing course. This course focuses on just grammar and how to construct the very basic sentence, which is our simple sentence, how to get a little bit more varied in our sentences, which is going to be combining essentially two simple sentences into one sentence, which is our compound sentence, and then how to get as sophisticated as we can at this level, which is a compound, which is a complex sentence. All of those together should give you nice varied writing. Please practice, 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 practice. You cannot practice too much. If you've enjoyed this course, hopefully there will be a follow-up course on writing. These are your 3 types of sentences. Again, I will be here at the end after you've gone through the worksheets to help walk you through how to get all of the correct answers.